first time this has ever happened to me. I started a new young adult novel, and I thought, well, it's going to be about siblings. It'll be similar to All Together Now. But I want to get the zombies out of there, so I'll put them in a cult. And then maybe there'll be a pandemic that happens. And then they'll be trying to get out at the end of the world, having been raised in a cult. What a brilliant story idea. So, of course, naturally, the first thing I do is I start reading the market. Anybody written anything like that? Never happened to me before, but by God, I came across Agnes at the end of the world. And I said, well, that was a good story idea. That's not up for debate. It works really well. I'm just going to have to retool mine because Kelly McWilliams accomplished it brilliantly. So Kelly McWilliams, I am thrilled to talk with you. I'm going to ask you for all kinds of tips on how to write my newer, better end of the world story about a cult, and we're going to talk about mirror girls and all kinds of other stuff. So welcome to the program. I'm thrilled to chat with you.
Thank you so much for having me. That is wild. I've been right there doing that market research. I'm pretty sure I did that for AGNES too, and you never expect to find the same like shuffling of themes and ideas. I will say AGNES originally, there was like some extraterrestrial activity in there. So maybe you could layer that into the story.
That's not for grabs. Well, that brings us back to the Book of David. I've already done my religion extraterrestrial activity, but you know what? There's always more.
I love it.
I started my research. I read The Project by Courtney Summers because Courtney Summers wrote oh shoot, what's the name of her zombie book? Something about the phone, the call, and I'm thanked in the back of it. It's so terrible that I can't think of the name. Anyway, I read the Project, and it was a wonderful book. I'm like, well, that's nothing like what I have planned. I'm in the clear. What's up next? Oh, it's Kelly McWilliams. Thank God it was the second book. It wasn't like number 5 because I'd already been almost to the finish line before realizing how much refiguring I had to do. So the esteemed audience knows that I will never summarize another author's biography or their book, although I've done a little bit of that tonight. But why would I want you to sit there and listen to me make a mess of either of those things when you're right here? So Kelly McWilliams, please give us an overview of your background and we'll go from there.
Yes, so I'll just start with Agnes at the End of the World. It's the story of a teenage girl who escapes from a fundamentalist cult that preaches that the end of the world is coming. She needs to escape because her younger brother has type 1 diabetes and he's not going to survive in this cult that forbids medicine and technology of all kinds and cordons everyone off from the outside world. But when she does flee to that outside world, when she finally gets up the courage, she's surprised and terrified to find that the world actually is ending. And the cause at that moment is a terrible pandemic, which has nothing to do with our current pandemic. It's more along the lines of a zombie apocalypse. This book did come out in June 2020, so I did not see the future. It was written well before that. But that's kind of the basic ingredients of that story. And it was a real blast to write. It's set in Arizona, where I grew up. Grew up in Arizona, went off to school and met my husband. We moved out to Hawaii and I lived there for a few years. And while I was in Hawaii, I actually was pregnant with my daughter and we had a Zika outbreak. Actually, it was like an international sort of outbreak. It was mostly localized in Latin America, but we had the type of mosquitoes that could spread it. And that's where I kind of got my first taste of that kind of public health disaster fear. And that was the inspiration for that layer of the apocalypse in Agnes's story. We shortly left Hawaii because we couldn't afford it anymore. And so we had to get somewhere on the mainland and, we didn't even know where. We were just wherever we could get, jobs set up. So we ended up in Colorado Springs, which was a very interesting landscape after having written Agnes, because it also has quite a lot of religion and a lot of fundamentalism too. So that was interesting to be finishing that story and revising that story around. And now I live in Seattle, which I'm enjoying a lot. Have only been here for a couple years. And this is where I wrote, actually, no, I guess I split it between Colorado Springs and here, but Mirror Girls, which is my book that came out in February. Yeah.
I've got all sorts of follow-up questions. I should quickly,
a lot. Yeah.
we've got time. We're going to cover them all. I should point out for esteemed audience, because it was driving me nuts, the book that Courtney Summers wrote about zombies is This Is Not a Test. It comes highly recommended. I am the Rob Kent thanked in the back because I bugged her for, I don't know, ever since she wrote Cracked Up to Be to the end, please write a zombie book. And she did. Probably would have if I hadn't bugged her, but it was still nice to be thanked in the back. So as far, we've got all kinds of things to talk about, because I know your mother is also a novelist, which I'm fascinated by. I want to talk about Mirror Girls, but you gave us a nice summary of AGNES at the End of the World. So let's dive in there, and we'll circle back to everything else. So you write that in 2017, 2020 comes along. We lived through an actual pandemic, and an actual a little bit of a conservative Christian uprising amongst us. As we record this, we are talking here at the end of July. Esteemed audience knows the deal. We record these episodes that come out much later, so they're probably listening to it in October or November. So hopefully the world has changed dramatically, but as we record this, that's where we're at. The Supreme Court has made a series of catastrophic conservative Christian fundamentalist decisions. So I expect that there will be a lot of books coming out in the near future about uprisings of cults and everybody. I think in the country, if you're not already in that sort of situation, kind of got their head snapped and like, wait, what are you folks planning? So this predates all of that. So now that you've lived through so much of this, are there any revisions that you would make? Anything that, yeah.
You know, it's funny, it predates it, but I think it sort of was growing alongside it in a funny kind of way. I, out in Hawaii, we had that sort of Zika scare. But when I actually gave birth to my daughter, it was on election day in 2016. And I remember my mother was there and I had been laboring through the day. And at the end, I asked, well, did we get my daughter a female president for her birthday? And her face just fell, like the nurses couldn't get out of the room fast enough. Because that was a really tough day. And I remember, I had done maybe a little bit of a draft of AGNES, but it was only my mentor really had seen it. It hadn't even sort of been through, to my editor. And that's when I sort of turned up the gas, I say, on the themes about, women's rebellion and need for liberation. That's sort of like, we didn't know what was going to happen now for sure, but there was definitely something in the air that you could smell sort of coming down the pike. And certainly like one of the first things I think a lot of us did think when Trump was elected was, what's going to happen with the Supreme Court. And to have seen it all sort of like the cards fall this way has been really, really strange. In terms of revising it, man, I don't know what I would do to sort of revise this story, but I do sometimes wonder about where some of these ex-cult members would be today and sort of what their sequel story might look like.
One thing that struck me is a lot of things. I absolutely fell in love with this book, but AGNES gets her hands on a smartphone, and AGNES is a true believer, but she starts to read about the outside world and facts get in there, and she starts to question what she's been taught. And that strikes me as a perfectly reasonable prediction about human behavior prior to about 2019, 2020, when I start arguing with family about should you wear masks, should you not wear masks, what is a fact, what's an alternate fact. And so now I wonder if a fundamentalist person got their hands on some facts, would it make a difference?
Which facts would they be? No, I completely agree with you. There's a strain that's been running through my fiction. Like I'm just at the tail end of finishing a novel, so I'm kind of reflecting on this stuff. In general, I've been optimistic about technology and about the internet and how it can connect us and shape our views for the better. Like you can see that kind of optimistic strain, that exactly once she gets that phone in her hands, her world cracks open and she starts to see things, as we would say, as they really are, as opposed to, that counter voice to what she's been told. But we know now that that there's all sorts of misinformation and disinformation and bad faith acting out there, that she very well could have tumbled into the wrong part of the internet and may have never have left that cult. that is something that I absolutely did not foresee. And my book that I just finished, I'm perhaps like ill-advisedly making predictions about where TikTok might take us. So I think AGNES, it was not a named social media company, but it was, Twitter, it was, Google, like what you can get through searching. But yes, I turned my gaze then to TikTok, and I was also similarly optimistic, and we will see how wrong I turn out to be. But it's true that AGNES is a true believer. And in terms of cult stories, when I was doing my own research into cult books, I didn't feel like I found so many books with the true believer. There were a lot of like characters with doubts, or characters who were just on board to play it safe. But I have always been fascinated by the psychology of, what happens to you if you're really subsumed by something. How do you climb up out of that? And Mirror Girls is a story that's set in the Jim Crow South. And that sounds like a very different thing. But when I talk to people, I'll sometimes say, like, what was Jim Crow except a brainwashing and cult situation? Brainwashing people to say this type of person is better, this type of person, deserves this. And so I think that I'm always interested in sort of how our minds can be changed. And then the challenge for me with AGNES was applying enough pressure through the story to her character to help her snap out of sort of the dream state that she was in. And what shocked me was just how difficult that was to make it a believable transition. So yes, she gets the phone, but she might not care about the phone. She might not agitate for the phone if her brother wasn't also sick and his life wasn't also at risk. And that she may not have been able to handle if her parents were more active. Her parents have sort of like fallen out of her lives. There were lots of like different variables. And I think we all live with this idea that, well, we could never be brainwashed. We would never wind up in a cult. But actually, people do, and it's not because they're lesser than us. They're exposed to different forces, and they have different things going on in their lives. And these kind of cult techniques, brainwashing, like disinformation campaigns, they're out there because they're extremely effective. And so that sort of like maze game of trying to find a believable way for AGNES's character to have the triumphant moment where she can escape from this cult was like one of the really fun challenges of the book.
Well, having been raised extremely religious, and then having gone to school and obtained knowledge that, wasn't just from one book. So,
Yes.
I like to think that, one, I'm keenly aware of just how easily people can be brainwashed, including myself. And two, I like to think that there's a bit of an inoculation that happens there, that afterwards I'm a lot more sensitive to anything that ever comes my way. That, okay, esteemed audience knows that I'm a flying saucer enthusiast, but there's a lot of garbage out there and lots of entryways for flying saucer based cults. So it's like, well, it's probably good that I had my religion early. That that I've heard arguments similar to this. I know where this is going.
That inoculation theory is a great one. I love that.
Did you know that women should be submissive to the? Yes, I've heard it before.
I don't know
what you're wrapping it up in. That's.
Yeah, it's funny just having even just done the research for this, the number of ways and places in our lives that people do try to exert a persuasive force. You see it even in, and this is a random aside, you don't necessarily have to include, but like even sort of in diet culture where people talk about the paleo diet, and someone was trying to convince me why we should be eating only paleo foods. And well, it's because our ancestors ate da 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 da. It was like, I feel like there might be some logical fallacies in there. There's some things that are being said that feel more persuasive to me than anything else. So I think in general, especially now in the world that we live in, being a little bit skeptical whenever anyone has a vested interest in swaying you strongly to one black or white way of thinking or another is just always wise for where we are today.
Except for when you're listening to the show, esteemed audience. If I said it's 100% true.
Right.
No, I would. Steve Dudley knows my background is in finance, and I knew some financial consultants who were placing stock trades with actual money based on something that a woman from their church who had visions in her dreams would come in and tell them. And I guess God was very because he looked around the world. He's like, oh, starving people over here, sickness and pestilence over there. No, I'm going to focus on these fellas in Indiana who got to make some money on the stock market.
That is wild. I will say, like, I grew up in Arizona, and the Southwest, like, we sometimes describe it as cult central. Like, if you want to start a cult, the Southwest might be the place to do it. I don't know if it's the heat. I don't know if it's the Wild West sensibility, but they sure have started a lot of cults out there. And the cult that was, like, not next door, but the closest to me, it was the Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints, which is not to be confused with the regular Mormon church. This is like an excommunicated off branch, but they were constantly on television. It was like a source of fascination for a lot of these communities. And I remember there was one day when the FBI raided that compound, and the women and children who lived there, it was very much, the AGNES style world. They wore prairie dresses. They, were in polygamous marriages. It was, a whole thing. They had tons of children, very little education, limited access to healthcare. And the FBI came and raided this place and tried to get the women and children out, and they refused to go. And I remember seeing that and wondering, like, how do you get to that place where help is perhaps being offered, but you can't take it? And what psychologically did that feel like, to feel that these offers of aid were actually attacks? So it's just was something that I had been fascinated with for such a long time.
Is that Fred Phelps, or was he somebody? Or what? Sorry, not Fred Phelps.
Oh, that was Warren Jeffs was the leader out there, and he's in prison now, but still operating the cult from afar. And this is the cult that you can also read about from John Krakauer. He wrote Under the Banner of Heaven, which I think was recently turned into a television series. But the book that is my favorite, if you want to read about this topic and that most directly inspired Agnes, was Escape by Carolyn Jessups. She was the first woman to escape from that cult with all of her children. And the mental fortitude that took, it's an amazing read. It's an amazing story. And it's very powerful to see, what she had to go through to sort of get out to the other side. And a lot of it was that she did have her children, and she wanted them to survive and to see a better world. And some of that I did try to echo with Agnes and her little brother Ezekiel, who is not going to be able to survive in this cult landscape that they're in.
It's also a Netflix series, if you're curious, esteemed audience, called Keep Sweet and Obey. Keep Sweet and Obey, Pray and Obey, I think. I don't know, Keep Sweet, look it up on Netflix. It'll come right up, and it's the story of Warren Jeffs. And I remember they interviewed a woman who admitted that at 19, she still thought that babies were brought by the stork. She had no idea that intercourse was a thing at 19. And then they interview women who later in the cult were worried that Warren Jeffs wouldn't come and take their children. They didn't leave the cult. And when he came and he took their children, like, oh, well, I guess this is God's will, and gave them over. It's just madness. Like, how does this happen to a person? And I read a quote from you in another interview I wanted to make sure I ask you about that very thing. Let's see, that we all kind of have a natural, every human being has a need to believe in something larger than themselves. So why do you think that is, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, it's a scary, lonely world. We have a spiritual dimension to our lives because it's a real need. I like however that manifests. Like, for me these days, it's really art and literature sort of filling that space for me. But you can't have kind of nothing in that space. There's kind of like, you just go to work, you eat, there's something that you have to believe in something. Otherwise you're going to feel alienation, you're going to feel disconnection, and it can be really very painful. And so when people actually go through spiritual crises, like, part of it is they may not want to leave the cult because, well, then what's out there for them after that? What do they believe in? What's bigger than them? How do they feel connected to the greater universe? I think we don't necessarily talk about that as much in culture because it's complex with, religion, but it really doesn't even have to be religion. Just that sense of that something is larger than you, that there's a meaning that you can get in touch with in some kind of way. And the cruelest thing that I think you can really do to a person is use that need for connection, for spirituality against them. And like, that's really what we see in cults, is that they're weaponizing the very human need to feel like there's something bigger than yourself. And they're using it to torture them and trap them and make them smaller. They'll say things like, well, whatever the force is that they've convinced you to believe in, you're letting them down if you do this, that, or the other. And it's really amazing the things that people will give up and the things that people will do to stay connected. They will go through periods of hunger. They'll stop eating. They'll lose or give up children. It's just a very powerful way to control people. And I think it's really tragic too, because on the other hand, we see that when we're in touch with this spiritual side of ourselves, we can like, it's the angels of our better nature. That's what helps us to make sacrifices that do good things for others. That's what helps us to change the world. So yeah, it's just such a shocking sort of affront to me when you see that getting twisted, because those people in the cult, you can think like, well, they must be weaker, or they're not that smart. That would be sort of like communities that I was raised in, what maybe they would say ungenerously about that type of person. And it's like, no, like maybe they're looking towards something greater, and that was just used against them, that it's not a sign actually at all of weakness in them, but maybe even strength.